Welcome to DIA Today, Democracy in America Today. I'm Matt Parks alongside Dave Corbin. Glad to have you with us as we explore the ideas behind today's headlines.
My left eye sees pollution. Those dirty fuels are burning. The earth's whole climate's churning. Clean energy solution. My right eye scans the bill. Fossil fuels are cheap. Wind and solar too steep. Drill, baby, drill. Predefined, misaligned, polarized division. Shuttered mind, worse than blind. 2020 vision.
How you doing, Dave? Doing well. Colorado has warmed up from its cold temps, and we're going to get into the 80s.
Wow.
This weekend. It's my normal DIA Today Colorado weather update. So it's it's fun. We've had a great season skiing all together. We probably have been about 20 times this year, went about 20 to 25 times last year, which was great. The kids are getting older though, so they have sports and then they have other interests.
Mm-hmm.
They want to do their own thing, which makes life a little more challenging in bringing them up there, but it's always a beautiful thing here to have skiing, and especially spring skiing.
Yeah, growing up, that was something we had a lot of fun doing. California, Pennsylvania, went up to New England a little bit here and there. So yeah, that's especially in the spring when it's, my fingers and toes tend to freeze when I'm skiing, but when you can get out there on a nice warm day, it's great.
Well, I haven't broken anything in 2 years. And I
Impressive.
can say that, knock on wood.
Yeah.
And maybe I've already had my last ski trip of the year. Maybe I'll go again, but then I don't want to end up with a broken leg before the next episode.
Yeah, we would always think about that the last couple of runs of the day, right? You're feeling loose, you haven't wiped out yet, broken anything. Okay, watch it. Don't get too confident, but finish up well and enjoy
Leave
the
good
ride
enough
home.
alone. Exactly.
Right. Good. Well, today we're going to talk about economic policy with a focus on, surprise, surprise, tariffs. So it's about 1 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon. And by the time we finish the episode, tariff policy may have changed a couple of times, but we're actually pretty well timed in some ways because yesterday was supposed to be the day the big tariffs kicked in beyond the 10% initial tariff that was put on every country last weekend. And we know just shortly after those tariffs were supposed to go live, President Trump put a 90-day pause on them for anyone who was open to negotiating. And I guess 75 countries or so had expressed an interest in negotiating. And so everyone but China. China's tariff is now up to 125%. Again, we'll see what the latest is after the show. And by the time you hear this in a couple of days' time, it could be higher still if China retaliates further. But this has been the big story of the last couple of weeks. And really, this is the number one economic priority of the Trump administration at this point. Certainly, there's things to talk about regarding taxes and spending and other matters, which we'll take up probably next time or as we continue to work our way through the developments of these first 100 days. But it seems like this is a good time for us to check in on the tariffs, to think about the history here, some of the background, the context for this. Tariffs have been a big American debate going all the way back to the earliest days, Hamilton and Jefferson, and then in the next generation, the tariff of abominations, which nearly led to the secession of South Carolina, early 1830s. And then we saw the Republicans pushing tariffs and Whigs pushing tariffs, 1850s, 1860s, and beyond. So this has been an issue we've been talking about for a long time. Hasn't been as much of an issue maybe the last decade or two. There's kind of a consensus in favor of free trade. You go back to NAFTA and some of the other decisions, GATT, that were established back when we were in college. But in the last decade or so, certainly with the rise of Trump, there's been a renewed interest in the impact of tariffs, the possibility of using tariffs as a mechanism for economic renewal or perhaps just evening things out internationally. So a lot to talk about, Dave. This is definitely the issue of the day.
Yeah, I think that the president has done an excellent job trying to point out a clear and present enemy, whether that's woke or China or whatever that thing is that is making life more difficult. And when he owns in on it, he then is prompted to come up with a way to resolve the problem. And in this case, the resolution is to have a tariff policy that forces China to the table. So I think it's well within the Trump way of doing politics. You've got to find out who the enemy is, define it, and then find out a way to destroy it or defeat it. So tariffs is the present instrument at his use.
Yeah, that's a good way of framing it. So let's take a step back and think about this again a little bit more historically. So as I mentioned a minute ago, the real first debate arose over tariffs in the United States just after the beginning of the Washington administration. So the Congress actually asked Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, to put together a report on the wisdom of tariffs and how that might be used potentially to encourage manufacturing. And it took him a little while. There were other things going on. So about a year and a half later, he produced his report on manufacturers. This was late 1791. And as all Hamilton writings, it was long, it was detailed, it was powerfully argued. And so he lays out about 30,000 words in favor of a policy that included a modest tariff, not really high tariffs, not meant to be prohibitory, but the tariff's job was to raise money, which could then be used to pay for bounties, as he called them. In other words, to encourage manufacturing. So some startup money, if you will, subsidies, we would call them today, for new manufacturing firms. And the goal was to diversify the economy, largely, overwhelmingly agrarian economy at that point, to give scope to a wider range of skills and abilities, and also some concerns regarding national security and national independence. We think about independence as a key word for the Washington administration. You want to talk about their foreign policy or domestic policy, the idea of securing, in some full sense, American independence, obviously that had been won by war in the decade before. But now the question was, how do you really ensure your place as a truly independent nation in a world of larger, more powerful nations, in a world where Britain was still a dominant power, France was still a dominant power with some interests in the Americas. So how do you establish yourself on the world stage as a power to be reckoned with, at least in the sense of to be left alone, so you can develop yourselves internally and begin to really build the Republican character and institutions that you're aiming to do. So one of the things I admire about his report is that early on, he lays out just about the best case you could in favor of unfettered free trade. So he puts us in the voice of a imagined critic of his position, and he lays it out. There's no straw man here. There's no caricature. There's no sarcasm. He gives you a nice distillation of Adam Smith. And he shows that on economic terms, and this is the first framework he uses for evaluating this policy, on economic terms, tariffs are a loser. Tariffs divert revenue and effort from more productive channels toward less productive channels. And so rather than having an industrial policy that tries to pick winners and losers, and we think about the way that 20th century progressives aimed to establish an economy that did that, and centralized powers that were trying to anticipate new industries or direct the national income or attention in this way or that. Rather than doing that, you let capital flow naturally, and it naturally flows to more productive channels and leads you to, when you talk about international trade, places where you have a comparative advantage over other nations. And so you may not have the wide range of manufactured goods, but you'll have some that Americans are especially good at compared to other nations. And so that economically, he argues, is the most productive course.
Yeah, I think you bring up an excellent word here to frame the debate, Matt, and that's the word independence. Of course, we know as Americans that the heart and soul of our country is the Declaration of Independence, in which we understand ourselves to be endowed by God with certain inalienable rights. And those rights eventually lead to our pursuit of happiness. I think likewise, as you've mentioned, Hamilton and Washington were very concerned about American foreign policy. and the way that we employed foreign policy for our independence. Foreign policy was a means to an end, which was the securing for Americans of their inalienable rights in the Declaration of Independence. So here, when Hamilton is making the case primarily against tariffs, he argues that private interest or independence on its own, left to itself, infallibly finds its own way to the most profitable employment. So there's a tie there between the independent choice and a profitable employment when it comes to trade. The question, however, becomes, can something be profitable for you, yet cut away at your independence longer term? I think it's kind of taking the question of tariffs and trade policy and efficiency as a goal for a nation's economic policy and kind of broadening it over a broader human landscape, I would say. So that's one comment I have at the front end of this.
Right, and that's exactly where he goes, because after giving this very compelling and succinct account of the case for free trade, he says, but that's not always true. There are exceptions. Most general theories, he says, admit of numerous exceptions, and there are a few, if any, of the political kind which do not blend a considerable portion of error with the truth they inculcate. And then he goes on to say, and that's the case here, that the United States needs a different policy that's related to certain cases and certain reasonable limitations. In other words, he says, I can define certain boundaries around some exceptions to this rule so that I can argue that while we know we will lose something in economic efficiency, that there's a loss we're going to have there economically, we will gain something more valuable still in terms of our independence. And so for now, under these circumstances, the wiser course is these modest tariffs along with the bounties meant to encourage manufacturing, rather than the doctrinaire free trade position that he articulates so well at the beginning of the document.
Yeah, ironically, isn't this amazing that he cares about a country that's declared its independence, that wants to be independent in foreign policy, takes a look at tariffs as an issue, makes the argument against them by and large, yet remains intellectually independent in his analysis of the situation. He maintains in his intellectual lucidity an ability to take on the issue and recognize that there are exceptions to the rule. Just a perfect example of independence at work in the human mind.
Right, exactly. And I think also just a model of debate when it comes to issues, right? So he recognizes trade-offs, that establishing a regime of tariffs and bounties does have costs economically. He recognizes the reasonableness of the other side, right? He acknowledges that and gives a fair hearing to that position. But then he gives very strong arguments against it. He goes on 7 points, as I say, 30,000 words. But, to be honest, I think the most important words are at the very beginning of the report. And I mentioned the context earlier. The opening words are, to the Speaker of the House of Representatives. He was writing a report to Congress at the request of Congress, giving the Washington administration's position on what ought to be done. Now, it turns out this policy wasn't really adopted. The tariffs were, by and large, the bounties were never established. A tariff policy went back and forth. It was something of a political football, as we said, for generations. But Hamilton respects his role as an executive officer, respects the role of the Congress, and uses that mechanism in order to establish what he hopes will be a coherent and long-term predictable policy, rather than one that depends upon executive decree and varies according to the day's headlines.
So he comes up with an assessment rightly employed by Washington, the executive, leader of the House of Representatives at that time, and even the court in understanding what its role may be on these matters would be beneficial to the common good of the country moving forward. And I think that's outstanding. And I'd mentioned earlier, Matt, that when you talk about an issue like tariffs and tariff as an instrument of foreign policy, we always have to be mindful of the end in sight, which is the common good of a country. And is that means satisfying the end, which is the common good of Americans. And it's clear here that Hamilton, in assessment, takes into account the larger picture of life in the United States, that there may be a need for startup funds. National security is important. So he has a macro level view of the situation. And I think this bleeds nicely into kind of how other great thinkers have thought about the issue of economies and economics and policy. And here I want to bring up quickly Plato's Republic and economics in the original city in Plato's Republic. Plato recognizes through the person of Socrates that there are always going to be people who buy and sell products, right? We labor, we build things, we buy and sell those things. This leads to a situation within any political community, whether it's the United States in the year 2025, Athens 2,500 years ago, in which you have people who keep shop, right? The shopkeepers of any political community. You also have the merchants who go from city to city buying and selling products. And then you have wage earners. And those are the three main types of people that Plato, through Socrates, places within the marketplace. So who are the shopkeepers? Who are the merchants? And who are the wage earners? And what is the proper relationship between those keeping shop, right? Those who sell merchandise and those who make it. I mean, this is the central issue, right, of economics, right, throughout, Western civilization. So what would you say, Matt, right now about the United States in the year 2025? What is our market? Who are our shopkeepers? What are the merchants? And what are the wage earners? Because if you take a look at how President Trump is assessing the issue of tariffs and assessing these three types of people and assessing markets, it'd be interesting to take Plato's formula and apply it to today. So what are your thoughts?
Well, I think he sees himself as primarily the champion of the wage earners. The shopkeeper, as the sort of the local shopkeeper, has largely disappeared. I mean, you still, you live in New York City, you still got bodegas on the corner and that kind of way of really localized supply lines, if you will. But we also have the world of Amazon and Walmart and Target, right? These other large online and sometimes big box also retailers that are really replacing some of those local shops. And then in terms of the merchants, right, the people that are making the connections between them, we also have the large companies that are engaged in international trade and that kind of a bigger regime there. So I think, he sees himself as somebody whose job it is to look out for the wage earner, particularly the wage earner in certain industries, right? In certain industries that have kind of a physical aspect to them.
Yeah, it's interesting because in the case of Amazon, Amazon seems to me to be both the shopkeeper, the shop,
right,
and the merchant.
right.
And then there's another group tied that is not mentioned here by Plato, but is present within American society in the 21st century, and those who profit off of not their work, right, but off of the work of others, right? So we put money into our stock portfolio and we expect to get money back by investing in certain merchants who are also shopkeepers. The market goes up, so does our stock portfolio. It goes down.
Right.
We're worried. I had some great friends here this week who were very concerned about tariffs as tied to their stock portfolio. They had other arguments to make as well, but it's a different dynamic in the 21st century
Right.
when a lot of your retirement is based upon what? How well the merchant shopkeeper is going to do for your retirement.
For sure. But yeah, I think one of the things that's clearly of a concern for Trump is the international element of this, right? And so, you saw this even in 19th century America. There was a lot of comment on, okay, now we have this nationalizing economy. Right? One of Wilson's concerns was you no longer had that relationship between the boss and the worker. And there were too many layers of bureaucracy between, and the boss was, 1,000 miles away in some far-flung office while the worker was on the factory line and didn't know anybody that could really do anything if there was a problem. So, as that picture has grown even bigger, right, it's not just national, but now international around the world economy, I'm trying to think about what does it mean to humanize work and to provide opportunities that are decent opportunities. How do you provide reasonable opportunities and good work and dignifying work for that class? That's been a question for 150 years. And it's certainly one that I think is right up front in this debate today.
Agreed. And I think that, but what we learn from Plato here, right, is that productivity is natural. We produce things as human beings. All right. To consume is natural as well, and to trade. All these things are natural. The fact that they're natural, okay, fine. Are they always healthy? Right? So to what degree, right, is trade healthy for the moral or psychological energy of a particular people? To what degree is productivity healthy? To what degree is consumption healthy? And when you take a look at these kind of categories of large things that are natural, and you ask yourself, are they always healthy? More likely than not, we're going to land on the side that it's really a good thing and a healthy thing to be productive. We never say, oh my goodness, that person is so productive. What a pain.
Right.
We like productivity. I do think in some ways that there are challenges with overconsumption or hyper consumption. And I think it's been interesting the way this has been played out, because a lot of this debate around tariffs and prices, et cetera, is linked toward American productivity or the lack thereof, or American consumer prices, high or low.
One of the unfortunate elements of it is sometimes it ends up being a rather condescending, right, way to talk about this when it comes to consumer goods. So, you can sort of sneer at somebody for wanting some foreign car or some item from abroad, or really cheap stuff from China or something like that. But we have to recognize that if all of a sudden we have a general price increase that's created by tariffs, it's not just going to be the fancy cheese and the nice German automobile that's going to be a problem. Right? People are going to have problems, as we saw in the last several years, just across the board, and there's going to be difficulties and new burdens people that are going to have to bear. So, one of the things I think we have to be mindful of in the debate over tariffs is just how much pain we're willing to inflict on people that don't have as much margin. I mean, the reality is, who can bear the steep increase of the cost of a Lamborghini? Well, we know who can bear that, those that buy Lamborghinis. But when a Ford truck is now 10% more expensive because the parts coming from abroad have been taxed through tariffs, and other pressures, inflationary pressures, have increased that price, as we saw over the last couple of years, right? Car prices have gone through the roof. And even just to hold on to your current car is difficult because the prices of replacement parts have gone up dramatically, right? There's real impact on the lives of the kind of people that President Trump seems to have a heart for in the policy, if the policy is not wisely imposed, whatever the impulse behind it.
That's true, but you've been in Walmart and you see a lot of hyper consumption in Walmart. And it's not just one bag of Doritos, it's 5 bags of Doritos. It's not just 5 Gatorades, it's 15 Gatorades. I mean, you've seen the soda aisles and all that. And I'm not trying to be RFK Jr. here, but there's a lot in a Walmart. There's a lot in a grocery store, especially in the middle of the grocery store, that's just relish, right? It's not meat and potatoes.
Yeah, well, that's
and
for
we
sure.
buy a lot of it, and we want a lot of it, and
Right.
it doesn't seem to be healthy for us.
Right.
I'm blowing back a little bit on this.
Yeah, it's okay. You want to be the nanny state nag, you can be that. But
I'm not saying don't do it. I'm just saying if the prices go up.
Yeah, but the price
on
went
some
up
of these
on
things,
eggs,
it's not the end of the world. Eggs, okay.
It's hard to be selective. That's the problem, right? When you impose general tariffs on everything, it doesn't just raise the price of the garbage. It raises the price of the eggs and the milk and the butter and the essentials too.
Understood. But then you can buy chickens and you can tend to those chickens.
All right. Yeah, we got an acre and a quarter. We could have some chickens.
I thought you had chickens. Oh, okay.
No, we talk about it, but we don't have chickens yet.
Okay. Yet. Okay. As tariff policy goes in, you'll have chickens.
We might very well.
All right. But just so the point I'm trying to make here in bringing up Plato and bringing up productivity and consumption is the following. I would make the case, Matt, that we were a much more productive nation 100 years ago than we are today. And I would make, secondly, the case that we consume much more today than we consumed 100 years ago. And then I would ask the question, is that a good thing or a bad thing? And I'm sure it's not black and white, and we have to use, like Hamilton, an assessment of it where we see, okay, the dangers, right, of lower production and the dangers of more consumption, but also the goodness that's come from all this as well. But it's not a black and white case. I mean, and I think the argument I'm trying to make is that it's the health of the city, it's the health of the country that should matter most, not one individual stock portfolio.
For sure.
I think there's more to this than GDP.
Yeah, 100%. And I think one of the challenges here is that tariffs are a very blunt instrument. And so if you want to make the case for less consumption, more productivity, we ought to do that, and we ought to model that. And there might be some policies that we can adopt that will help with that. But a tariff is a very blunt instrument for trying to do that. And it's very difficult when you get involved, especially with general tariffs like this, to have the impact be the one you want, right? There's always this spillover effects. And so that's why I think if those are the goals, and if those are worthy goals, that a tariff is an unlikely instrument to get you where you want to go.
Well, I'm going to guarantee you one thing, that the president looked at neither Plato's Republic nor Hamilton's report on manufacturers when he made this policy. But what about the Trump tariffs? Okay, so background, Hamilton says tariffs can be used in certain places that are good. Plato suggests to us, well, let's take a look at the overall economy and trade and the healthy nature of a people. What's the argument against the tariffs? What's the best argument against the tariffs? And then what's an argument for the Trump tariffs?
Okay, well, let's start with the argument against. Our old colleague, Paul Mueller, has been out there. He works for the American Institute for Economic Research, and he's written a number of op-eds about tariffs. Wrote one most recently about 2 months ago, right after the inauguration, and tried to lay out an argument against tariffs. And basically his argument was an economic one, that you think you're going to save jobs, and you do in a certain sense. You save jobs in certain sectors that are high profile. You bring back those jobs, but at what cost? The problem is economic estimates are such that every job you save through tariffs costs about $1 million. Now, you're not paying that person $1 million. So you didn't get equal value. And so where's that $1 million coming from? Well, it's being extracted from somewhere else in the economy. So maybe 5 people somewhere else, aggregate, lost their job in order to get that one job back. Or maybe it was 2 people or whatever. But the point is that while you help in the targeted industries, the overall productivity of the economy goes down. And so overall, you're not better off. You're not better off either from the standpoint of employment, because you're focused only on the happy side of the story and not the unhappy side, which is obscured from view, or efficiency, because you've propped up an industry that's not as efficient and taken capital that would have otherwise flowed to ones that were more efficient. So you can make the case, we want that anyway, right? And that's a reasonable case in some contexts. That's Hamilton's point. But don't say you can have your cake and eat it too, right? Don't tell us that these high tariffs are going to bring back manufacturing jobs and there's no negative consequence that comes along with that.
Right. So Paul, at least in this situation, is not making the case that Trump is purposely pursuing an anti-growth policy. There's another individual, however, in this debate making the case against Trump tariffs, Noah Rothman, who says just that. So what's Rothman's argument from the National Review?
When you look at it and you see the economic consequences, those that are defending the Trump position are saying things like, well, hey, so what if you have to pay a little more for this? Or so what if prices of this go up, or we have to, we're going to all lose something. We're all going to suffer. There was an interesting quote that was out there this morning from President Trump saying that he didn't mind if his policies brought on a recession. He just didn't want a depression, right? So, a certain amount of pain was okay, but really bad situation. He didn't want that on his record. So the overall defense after you get to a certain point has been, well, take your medicine, right? Eat your spinach. For the long-term greater good or for the good of this group of people that we really admire, everybody else is going to have to be willing to suffer.
Well, turning to the argument for his tariff policies, you may have been reading other things, Matt, but by and large, the argument for tariffs Trump policies to me have been based upon there are globalist elites and then there are blue collar American workers. And globalist elites have ruled for a long time. They've tended to their own stock portfolios, to the money they've made. They never lose money. But in the case of Americans losing jobs throughout this country, the blue collar has taken a huge hit, and it's time for a blue collar renaissance. A blue collar renaissance equates with making America great again. The tariffs are an instrument that will tend toward that blue collar renaissance and then thus make America great again. I think there's something to this argument in reality, right? I think you can look at, the nature of American society in the year 2025 as opposed to 1975, as opposed to 1955, et cetera, and seen, right, that we have a different economy today than we did back then. And you look at many people who have made, gazillions of dollars off of the way that quote unquote free trade has worked in the last 100 years. Will the tariff actually have the effect that President Trump wants it to? Will it lead to a blue collar renaissance? I think the argument you're making, Matt, through Paul Mueller and Noah is that it won't. That you may want to do that, but this is not the proper instrument to use to do that.
Yeah, I think you can, to a certain degree, bring back manufacturing jobs, but you will do it in a way that costs other people that you don't identify and maybe don't identify with, that will cost them their jobs. There was an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal this morning, which is, of course, if there's anybody who speaks for the global elite, it's the Wall Street Journal. But on this, Main Street versus Wall Street kind of dynamic. And, that's sort of a classic populist trope. It has been pretty much from the beginning. As long as there's been a Wall Street, there's been a Main Street that's been opposed to it. But I think we all recognize that, let's say you're in one of those, nice union jobs, auto worker in Detroit. Where's your retirement coming from, right? Your retirement is coming from the pension or the 401k that you're investing. You're involved, right, in those same kinds of Wall Street investments. This isn't something that's just for, the top 1%, but the health of the global economy has a big impact on you. And who's buying your cars? Well, some Americans are buying your cars, but not everybody. Only 5% of the world is American. So if you want to find a market for your product, you got to be able to take it beyond your shores. And so there's I think kind of a caricature that ends up being used here that pits these two groups as if, you've got the fancy cheese and wine group on the one side and the real Americans on the other. And there's no mutual interest that connects the two. I think both have a financial interest in a healthy global economy. Whether a tariff can be used to help adjust that in certain directions, bring down trade barriers, use that as a negotiating tactic for improving trade around the world, fair enough. But I think it's foolish to pit this as some just entirely populist cause where the only people that are going to be hurt by these policies are the people we don't like, those rich hoity-toity Hamptons folks.
All right. Second argument for the Trump tariffs. This is interesting, and because Paul Mueller at least makes an allowance for this. He says that targeted tariffs on China to protect national geopolitical interests is one thing. Targeted, would that be 125%? Maybe. I don't know. We'll have to ask Dr. Mueller, but it's, kidding aside, if this is a national security issue and China's economic policies, their foreign policy more broadly, is a threat to the United States, we've got to secure ourselves against that threat. And there have been arguments made that really this is about China and that we ought to have in place a trade policy that produces the desired effect from China in our relations with them. Now, you would make a case that perhaps it'll work, perhaps it won't. What do you think, Matt, on the idea of using tariffs with the Chinese as
Well,
a tool?
I think it's one of the tools you have available to you. You know, it's interesting because one of the arguments that was made was, well, what you want to do is have tariffs all around because you don't want the Chinese to move goods to some other country and then from there to the U.S. to avoid the tariffs for goods coming from China. So you can't just have 10% tariff everywhere and 125% in China because then they just move things to India or Singapore or somewhere else, and then they move them to America from there. So you have to have high tariffs all around if you really want to effectively combat the Chinese problem. So as a policy matter, the current policy of the moment doesn't seem like it's well chosen to do that. But yeah, is it reasonable to try to use tariffs as one instrument to try to deal with the Chinese threat? Sure. And intellectual property violations and the slave labor conditions in China that are so ubiquitous. I mean, back in the day, I wasn't in favor of China being brought into the WTO or being given most favored nation status. So I think perfectly reasonable to look at the way they do human rights and the way they engage in the economy and have real concerns about that and be looking for tools, including perhaps tariffs, in order to do something about that.
Yeah, I think on this point, it's interesting that our mentor took a look historically at the use of tariffs as an instrument of foreign policy and pointed out that in most cases it doesn't work because, as you mentioned, it's a blunt instrument. For example, the use of tariffs and sanctions against Japan prior to World War II, they didn't work, Codevilla argued, because, quote, the sanctions convinced Japan that America was unwilling, perhaps morally and politically unable to do anything other than cut off trade. So if you take that thought and you apply it to the 21st century in China, if China thinks that the only instrument that we're going to use is this economic instrument and we're not willing to kind of defend our interests more broadly, then is any of this going to prevent them from what many people see as a coming invasion of Taiwan in the next 2 to 3 to 4 years? So that's one point. The second point Codevilla makes is that the use of tariffs and sanctions against a particular nation often misses the main target, which is the ruling element of that state, because that ruling element does what? They make others within their community, right, bear the brunt of the damage of the tariff itself.
Yeah, the Chinese elites will not bear the brunt of this. Right? They will find ways to pass that along, if you will, to the Chinese people who are not any particular danger or threat to American prosperity. All right, we've talked about the case for the Trump policies, the case against the Trump policies. Where does this leave us, Dave? What are your thoughts tying it all together?
Well, I just wonder, we talk about a free trade regime. How free is the free trade regime that's currently in place? We talk about a swamp, we talk about the haves and have-nots, et cetera, and the way that these outfits like the European Union, NAFTA, and all the rest are able to manipulate policy for their own good. So there's an argument against Trump's tariffs being more government involvement, et cetera, but we already have a lot of that. So what's wrong with fighting on the other side would be one question that I had. And the second point, it goes back to this argument from Plato. The health of the United States consists more than simply our GDP. We're going to survive and flourish depending upon how much positive, moral, and psychological energy that we have as a nation and that we have as a people. And when I look out there, I see that in pockets, but I oftentimes see not a lot of moral and psychological energy. And that's tied to the work that people are doing and the work that they're not doing. So I just to bring those two things to the fore. It's not tied necessarily to tariffs, but the broader economic picture of how we live as a country.
Yeah, I think that's an important consideration. It's one of the things, again, I admire about Hamilton, really about the Federalists of that Washington era. They recognized that economic efficiency wasn't the only question when it comes to building a national character. In fact, it was maybe a secondary or tertiary question. And, we know just how much our politics is dominated by it's the economy stupid kind of thinking. And so I don't want to make the case against tariffs simply on the basis of economic inefficiency. that case is absolute lock, right? There's no question that tariffs are economically inefficient. So I think arguments that imagine you can have a high tariff regime and economic prosperity at a degree that we've not had, I think are missing all history and the logic of what happens when you have high tariffs. But it doesn't mean you can't make a case. And I think what's, the weakness on President Trump's side is that he just doesn't really make that case. Are the high tariffs a negotiating tactic to actually usher in an era of really free trade, not just pseudo free trade? Are they actually meant to be permanent and a way of creating Fortress America and protect American jobs forever? Are they something in between? Are they targeted at China? And you can find good arguments justifying the policy on all of these grounds. And we've talked about some of those, and we've read more of those that we haven't mentioned on the show. But there's not any ultimately coherent vision that's been articulated, nor a policy that could actually easily be adopted in law, which is how tariff policy ought to be set. It's not an accident that when we find ourselves receiving executive decrees on this, that it's up today, down tomorrow, and no one's quite sure what the next day's headlines will bring. That's the nature of decrees. And that's why we don't have law by decree as our underlying system. We want stability. We want the rule of law. We want predictability. We want debate. We want deliberation. And all these things have been absent from this debate. So whatever case there is for tariffs could be made well in a national television address, followed by a nice white paper, followed by a real congressional debate, followed by a public debate that goes along with that. And then let's see where we land. And let's see why we're doing it, go with our eyes open on the economic consequences, and count the cost, both economically and in terms of national character, and see where we land. But that's not the debate we've been having. And so I fear that what we're going to do is get the worst of all possible worlds. Right? We'll get the economic chaos without any of the possible benefits that could come from a well-chosen, well-designed tariff policy.
So first term, he was barking. This term, he's biting. You hope in the next 3 years, he's legislating.
That would be nice.
From bark to bite to legislation.
To legislation.
Okay.
Well, we'll check in 20 days and we'll see where we are after the full 100 has expired. Before we wrap up the show, we've got to go back to Tocqueville's crystal ball. Dave, one of the advantages of only doing a show every 3 weeks is that only the most misanthropic remember our predictions from 3 weeks ago. So
I'm one of them. You said something about the SEC being overrated.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Well, that was kind of true because 6 of their teams lost in the first round.
They had 15 teams or whatever it was.
So
okay.
the top end of the SEC was as advertised. There's no question about that. But Duke did not win, as we predicted, nor did St. John's make it to the second weekend, much less the final game. We were in a pool with your family and your wife's family, and neither of us covered with honor there. I think I tied with your wife for 7th place. You were in 11th out of 17, I believe. So we're just going to put that behind us and move on.
So our crystal ball has to deal with the Masters tournament, which is this weekend. So we're taping on Thursday. Sunday we'll have a Masters winner without bad weather. So I'm going to go in the opposite direction. Matt, you know that I'm a Jordan Spieth fan. He's the most enjoyable player to watch when you're watching because he just shows everything that's going on. He manages to hit these shots into the middle of nowhere and then get them back on the green. So I love Spieth, but I've got to go with Scottie Scheffler for my winner of the tournament. After last year's PGA Championship in Louisville, where he gets arrested and then comes back and plays that day and plays that weekend and plays well, I will never bet against Scottie Scheffler again. Yeah. Golf is a game of nerves.
Yeah.
How that guy did that, unbelievable. One of the he didn't win, but an amazing story. He's a great guy as well. So Scheffler's my pick for the Masters victory. I'm gonna say that Spieth finishes fifth. Has a good tournament. Yeah, has an outside shot on Sunday, but Scheffler's too good.
Okay.
How about you?
Yeah, well, that's fair enough. I mean, Scheffler is definitely the guy to beat every tournament he enters. A little bit of a slow start to the year because he's been getting over an injury and recovery from that, but it seems like he's off to a good start. We had the advantage of the first run is underway as we're speaking, so I think he's 3 under. The leader is at 4, so he's in a good spot. My guy hasn't teed off, or maybe it's just teed off. I'm going to go with Xander Schauffele.
Good
Obviously,
choice.
won 2 majors last year. Finally, seemed to put it together, but he's done very well historically at the Masters. A couple of recent top 5 finishes, so I think always somebody you've got to watch out for. I love Spieth too. But Spieth at Augusta scares me because there's, Rays Creek is always there. And you can always count on Spieth to get his couple double bogeys. And,
Yep.
and
Oh, yeah.
that's the killer.
Yeah.
The thing that he didn't used to do when he was, grinding out tournaments and winning majors, he avoided the double bogeys, and that driver has just been not reliable enough for him in recent years. So I've got him 17th. So that's good finish. And I think he's coming back this year. Last year was a poor year for him. He'll do better, but I don't think he's going to be there in the final leaderboard. But Xander Schauffele, I think we'll take it. Maybe over Scheffler, but
yeah, but not Scheffler. I'd say Morikawa, but I'm going to stick with Scheffler, and I'll still be cheering on Spieth. He's just fun to watch. So
yep, absolutely.
Great, Matt.
All right, well, that's going to wrap it up for this week's show. Thank you as always for joining us. If you want to reach out to us, you can always contact us through our email at democracyinamericatoday@gmail.com. Look forward to talking to you again soon.